good evening, and hello to everyone online as well. Thank you all so much for being here in the last time slot on Thursday, right before the party. We know you're excited, so we really appreciate you hanging in there with us to talk about Experience Builder. My name is Paige Waterbury. I'm a software developer in Esri's Professional Services Department, and I'm here with my colleague Gavin.
I'm Gavin Raykemper. I'm a developer team lead, also with Professional Services.
And we have our colleague Wei moderating the chat for us. And today we'll be talking about ArcGIS Experience Builder Advanced Customization. Before we get into any of the content of the session, we'd like to ask that you guys take some time after the session ends, maybe as you're walking over to the party, to leave us some feedback. All of your feedback is read and reviewed and taken very seriously, so please, whatever you liked, whatever you didn't like, let us know. And with that, I'll get right into the agenda. So first, we're going to talk about a quick intro to Experience Builder Dev Edition. Then we'll get into custom widget development and code collaboration. Then we'll follow that up with a conversation on deployment and automating your deployments. Then we'll talk about data sources and widget communication. And finally, we'll open up the floor for any questions. So some key information about Experience Builder Dev Edition. The current version that is publicly available is 1.19, and the next version, 1.20, will be coming in late March, so in just a couple weeks from now. Experience Builder is built on React, which is a JavaScript library, TypeScript, which is a superset of JavaScript, and GMU, which is Experience Builder's extensibility framework, which provides a lot of the building blocks, not only for UI components, but also for interacting with data sources and so on. So as you get going with your Experience Builder development, these three technologies are really core to being successful in that. And for those who have experience with Web App Builder custom widget development, the concepts of the manifest and the config still remain in Experience Builder, so that should be very familiar, even though the technology is very different. And now we're going to jump right into our first demo on custom widget development. And in this demo, I'm going to demonstrate how to create a settings panel to connect to a data source. And then within our widget, we're going to use the ArcGIS charts components, web component. And so let me jump over. I did already get my server and client running within VS Code, so I will instead go right over to the builder interface of Experience Builder Dev. And just to show that that is in fact up and running, and I've already set up a web map for myself, which contains just one data source displaying hurricanes and other natural disasters, primarily focused around Australia. Okay. So now let's jump into the code. I'm going to start by walking us through the settings.tsx file. And so I have all of my imports up top. I'm importing immutable. I'm importing the type all widget settings props, use data source, and then finally I'm importing data source selector and all data source types. And I'm exporting this setting page. I have one method here that I'm defining called onDataSourceChange, which I will call whenever the data source is set, and that will call the onSettingChange method on props. And in the actual UI of my settings panel, I just have this one component, the data source selector, with a label that says data source. And I'm specifying here that the only type of data source that a user could select is a feature layer. And then, like I mentioned, on change, or whenever that data source is initially selected or changed anytime after, my onDataSourceChange method will be called. So now let me jump over to the widget.tsx file and we will walk through that, and then we'll actually bring this widget into our experience and see what it looks like to the end user. So first I have all of my imports. I'm importing React, all widget props, data source manager, and data source component. One thing that is really key, and that is a new concept with web components, is how I'm importing ArcGIS charts components right here on line 3. And we'll see a little bit further down how I can then use that ArcGIS chart web component. And now within my actual widget code, I'm defining one state variable, which is the layer ID. I have one method on data source created, which I'm going to call when that data source component mounts. And then I have some logic in here where if a user has not yet selected a data source from the settings pane, I'm just going to display some text that says, please select a data source in the widget settings. And then the UI I'm returning is super simple. I have my ArcGIS chart web component, and I'm passing it a layer item ID. And the way I'm getting this is when the user selects that data source in the settings, we're gonna get the data source manager, and from that I can get the data source itself, and then read the JSON, and within that JSON, the data source's item ID exists as a property. And so that property I'm going to pass in to my layer item ID property on the ArcGIS chart. And by default, assuming that this layer has a chart defined that would have been set up in the web map, it's going to choose the 0 index chart to display. I could specify the the index property and specify otherwise. However, I know that this particular layer only has one chart, so I'm just going to leave it off. So now I'll switch over to my browser. And if I scroll down to the left, or the very bottom of that insert widget pane on the left-hand side, I see my chart components custom widget. A little smaller. And I see the text, please select a data source in the widget settings. I can select that, and from my map, I'm going to choose this observed position layer. And now, instantly, a calendar heat chart renders within my widget, which, in fact, if I were to go to this web map and look at this particular layer, I would see that that is the chart that has been configured, the one and only chart that's been configured for that layer. So I'll go ahead and save this. And I will jump back to VS Code. Yeah, okay, I think, no, yeah, that was good. That was everything I wanted to cover on that. So now I have my custom widget fully developed. Obviously I could keep going, but just a demo of how I'm using the ArcGIS charts web components within my widget. Okay. Assuming I wanted to keep building on this, and maybe I want to work on this widget with colleagues. I'm not just a solo developer. I want maybe Gavin to keep working on it with me. One question that comes up a lot is, what is the best way to actually collaborate on a widget? I don't want to push the entire Experience Builder Dev Edition up to a GitHub repo or any other repo in most cases. And so there's a very specific setup that we can do to make this work pretty seamlessly. So we need to create a directory at the root of the client directory. And this would, in theory, be your cloned GitHub repo. And that directory needs to contain a manifest.json file whose type property equals exb web extension repo. And that directory can then contain a widgets and or themes folder, which would be where all of your widget code or theme code would live. And so let me show you this in VS Code. So typically, if we're looking in our client directory, we would look to our Your Extensions folder and then either themes or widgets, depending on what we're developing, to place our custom code. However, now we can instead have a folder at the root of the client folder. So in my case, I'm calling it Code Collab Demo. And this folder has a manifest.json file. And the key part here is the type property being set to EXB web extension repo. And then I have a widgets folder within Code Collab Demo, and my one and only widget that's in there at the moment is chart components. But now I can push and pull this theoretical GitHub repo and make it really easy and seamless for me to collaborate on this with colleagues. And when you run npm start in the client folder, it will know because you've specified this type of EXB web extension repo to go looking for any widgets within that directory. So that is how we best can collaborate on widget development. Now I'm going to hand it over to Gavin to talk about deployment.
Great. Thanks, Paige. So once you've built your custom widget and added them to experiences, how do we actually deploy it for others to use? It's the most important part of our job, right? Making what we build available to our users. So I love this topic of deployment. There are two patterns to deploy experiences with your custom widgets. You can either deploy onto ArcGIS Enterprise, or you can deploy using the Developer Edition by exporting it and hosting the experience on a web server. You might be noticing that ArcGIS Online isn't listed here. Using the Experience Builder version that's in ArcGIS Online is a great pattern, and lots of experience apps are deployed there for access to the public or in groups or limited. But you cannot deploy custom widgets and themes to ArcGIS Online right now. So to deploy your experience that contains custom widgets, you either need to deploy to ArcGIS Enterprise or using Developer Edition. And I'll go through both of these patterns in the next few slides. So if you'd like to deploy to ArcGIS Enterprise, the first step is deploying your custom widgets to the Experience Builder version that's in ArcGIS Enterprise. So you'll need version 11.0 or higher, which is every year it gets older and older, so that I hope that's not a big deal for most of you. Once you do that, the custom widgets will be available for use in Experience Builder, and your users can build experiences using those custom widgets. And the experience apps that are available on your portal, you can share them just like any other content item, public, organization, or only to certain groups. So deploying the custom widget to ArcGIS Enterprise is not that hard. You have to host the files on an HTTP server, and then you create a new item in ArcGIS Enterprise for that widget. And so I'll kind of show how to do that right now. So here I've got Experience Builder version running in ArcGIS Enterprise. I think it's version 11.5 or something like that. And I'm going to create a new experience. And I've got a fancy template for Dev Summit here. I wanted to show first that if I unlock the layout and I go to widgets, as Paige was showing earlier, our custom widgets are always going to be in this bottom section here in the Builder interface. And right now, we don't have any custom widgets. So we want to add a custom widget here. So let's do that right now. So like I said in the slides, we will host our widget files out on a web server. In this case, I've hosted my files out on GitHub Pages. But a lot of times people, if they have simple ArcGIS Enterprise setups, they'll host the files just on the IIS folder that's on your ArcGIS Enterprise machine. That's common. Or if you have a web server that's available within your company or something like that, they'll host the files there. So not too hard to just host the plain files. And then I'm going to take the URL of the manifest.json in those files, and I'm going to copy it and then I'm going to go to my ArcGIS Enterprise and log in and go to the content page. So on the content page, I'm going to click New Item, Application, and then as long as you're in version 11.0 or higher, you have this nice little option called Experience Builder widget, which pretty self-explanatory of what we want to do. Once I select that, it's asking for my manifest URL. I'll paste that right in. So you can give it a nice title, I'll add layers, and like any other content type in ArcGIS Enterprise, you can give it tags and description and stuff like that. And so now I've got an item that represents this custom widget in my ArcGIS Enterprise, and it even has this spiffy special type and its own special icon, and it's really cool. So now once I have that, it's immediately available in the Experience Builder version that's in ArcGIS Enterprise. So now I'll go back to my experience that I was building and just refresh the page. And so now we have this option right here under the custom area, add layers. And that's kind of how that works. So that's ArcGIS Enterprise, getting custom widgets in there. For Developer Edition, you first build your experience in Developer Edition, and using the custom widgets that you need straight from there. You've already been building your custom widgets in Developer Edition, so really you just have to build your application and include those widgets. Then you go to the three-dot menu at the top right, and then click Download. And this will give you a zip file of all the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files for your application. You can then, I think when you're downloading it, there's a checkbox to include the client ID. That's something that's fairly new. So you can check that on. That makes sure that the kind of login process, if you have private content in your experience, works properly. And then you just copy the files to any web server like IIS, Apache, or even like modern hosting platforms like GitHub Pages, AWS S3. Really, you have a lot of flexibility because there's no server-side requirement. These are really just plain files that you just need to get hosted on a web server somewhere. So it's really shouldn't be a big deal in 2026. So that's those are the two options how to kind of deploy. So that's how to deploy, but what if we want to go to the next level and automate those deployments? Let's talk about that now. If you're kind of a moderate to advanced development group working with Experience Builder custom widgets, I highly encourage you to set up an automated build system. The builds are faster since they're automatic with no manual involvement. The builds are more consistent since there's no annoying humans to screw something up. The automated builds are easier for testers. So as soon as you check in your code, your testers can almost immediately go to the place where your build is building and start using it. Finally, who's ever done some development, shared it with a team member, and it worked on your machine, but it didn't work on their machine? Does that happen to anyone? Okay, thank you. Never, somebody said. Do you want a job? We'll hire you. It's happened to all of us, but if you have a dev environment with automated build set up, you can use that kind of as the third copy. That's kind of the arbiter of who's right and who's wrong. If it works on my machine, but it doesn't work on your machine, let's check how it works in the automated build, and that can kind of be the decider. So it's a really, really good thing to do. In general, to automate, we need to store the config.json file that represents the Experience Builder application in our code repository. If you're not familiar, I think most of you probably are, but like when you're building your experience, really and when you click save, it's everything you do in the builder interface is kind of being translated into a big config.json file, and that represents your experience. And that's what we need to save. Then our CI/CD platform will take that config.json, include our custom widgets if we have any, and output the files to your dev environment. You can use any of the modern CI/CD platforms like Azure DevOps, GitHub, GitLab, Jenkins, AWS Code Pipelines, really anything. All these are kind of fairly similar. The syntax is different with all of them, but they all do essentially the same thing. Today, I'll be showing you code for GitHub Actions, but any of these should work. And you'll just have to write the pipeline code in whatever you want. So the general folder structure that I follow is a web extension repo that Paige was just showing us. But I also add a folder named apps, which is where we store that config.json representing our Experience Builder app. You can get this config.json file from the server/public folder in your developer edition of Experience Builder. So now we're kind of getting into the platform specific steps. So again, I'm using GitHub Actions. So in GitHub Actions, you'll create a file inside the .github/workflows folder. And then you can create a YML file or YAML file, I guess people call it. It can really be named anything. In my case here, we're calling it buildapp.yml. And now let me do a demo here. Let me demo this. Okay. So I have this GitHub repo that is public, so you can go here and see this example as well yourself. I've been kind of showing it for the past few years, but I'll kind of use this. Like I was saying earlier, this is that structure that I was just showing you. We've got a widgets folder, and can you all see this in the back? Sorry. Yeah. Okay. We've got a widgets folder with the example custom widget that I was just showing, an example theme as well. And then I've got the manifest.json file that's of type web extension repo, like we were talking about earlier. And then in the two extra things that I was talking about is in the apps folder, I have a folder named 0 that represents the files for the Experience Builder app. And here's that config.json that I was talking about. So I'm going to edit this. Going to do a live demo of this, which is always a great idea, right? So I'm going to find down here, and this is a huge config.json if you haven't opened it before. You can kind of, if you read through it and you start thinking about it and you look through like what are the widget types and what are the widget names, you can usually figure out what's going on. And in this case, I've just scrolled down to an area that, it's a text widget, and then this is basically the title, the top text on the experience that I have. So right now it says Experience Builder DevOps example. Maybe I'll just put Dev Summit here or something. And then I'll commit this directly to my main branch. And now that I've committed that, I've got my GitHub Actions set up so that anytime I commit that, it's going to run those GitHub Actions. Now, what does that GitHub action look like? How do we tell GitHub what to do? Well, that's in the, as I mentioned earlier, .github folder. So while the GitHub action is running, I'll show you kind of the code that tells GitHub what to do. I'll make it a little bit bigger here. This is, if you're familiar with GitHub Actions, this isn't any crazy code or anything. It's pretty standard, almost like a shell script, basically just like some steps to do. First, we are going out and downloading the Experience Builder files from arcgis.com. We wanted to do that for this repo just because we didn't want to store it. In your example, I think a lot of you that we've talked to kind of maybe store the Experience Builder Developer Edition on a local file server or something like that. But in this case, we're just downloading it from the web. And then we are basically doing everything that you do when you run Developer Edition yourself, right? We're unzipping the zip file, we're getting our custom widgets into the right location, getting our custom themes into the right location, and running the npm installs. So those, if you've ever run Developer Edition, you know exactly what it's doing. These are just kind of the step-by-step instructions telling the computer what to do. And then finally, this is the most important part, right? So we get all that stuff into the right place, but you don't actually run to run the builder interface because you don't have a way in your CI/CD platform to kind of like automatedly like click download on the little 3-dot menu, which is what I was talking about earlier. Luckily, Experience Builder has provided us a script that we can effectively run that output of the zip file without actually running the builder, which is really cool. And that's this code here. And this is documented also on our the Experience Builder documentation on the deploy page. This line is really documented well, but basically it's just calling this .zip app function, and we tell it the folder name, which you may remember the folder name is named 0, and then we tell it what the zip file that we output should be named. And so that'll create that zip file that then is deployable. For you, you might unzip that and then copy it out to your web server for your organization or something like that. In my case, because this is a demo on GitHub, I'm using GitHub Pages, which is a separate GitHub feature where I can host files on GitHub for free. So I'm taking that zip file and using GitHub Pages to host it on the GitHub hosting. So that's kind of how this works. Again, this is a public repo. You can come to it if you'd like to see the code yourself. But let's see if that action that I kicked off earlier is done. It looks like it is. So I'll open up the page in GitHub Pages, and drum roll, there's our Dev Summit, right? This is what I changed it to. So there's a successful run. There's one example that I didn't have to run anything really. All I did was make a change in my repo, and all of my automations ran, and I've got an Experience Builder application out of it, which is pretty cool. Cool? Yeah? All right. Thank you. Asking for applause. Thank you. I guess some notes about that, just to wrap it up, wrap up this section. Like, if you have set up automated builds, you'll have a lot of nice benefits. Your outputs will be more consistent. You'll have easier version management. You'll be able to resolve bugs faster. You'll find that you have more organized management of your app config, which is something that I think probably lots of us can relate to. Like, maybe you're working with multiple people and they're all making changes to the application. When you've got that config.json checked in, it kind of enforces us all to organize around that a little bit better. So it's all great things. So please do this if you can. And feel free to even expand on this. This is one basic example. We're not saying that this is the only example. I've talked to many of you throughout this week's where you're doing even more advanced automated builds with containers and things of that nature to make this even smoother. So you can really do a lot, and yeah, just kind of have fun with it and use it to make your life easier. So for these last few sections, we wanted to talk about some more advanced topics of Experience Builder that you might not have used extensively or at all. The first one is data sources. Data sources define how your widget accesses data. So take, for example, data from an ArcGIS feature service. Data sources, or in this case, the feature layer data source class, is the best practice way that you can query and interact with that feature service within custom Experience Builder widgets. It's important to use these because it's how widgets share data and use data throughout the Experience Builder. So you can think of data sources almost like a database table. It has a schema, it has records, which the rows, they're called data source records, and it can have child or parent data sources. There are a few commonly used classes and components that Experience Builder provides to help you work with data sources. Data Source Manager is a class that manages the data sources, and you can use that to create data sources or get data sources when you pass it a data source ID, which is, I think, what Paige was doing earlier in her example. The data source component is a React component that is provided with Experience Builder that simplifies the use of data sources in certain cases. And the component is really great when you want to display data in a data source. It allows you to not have to use the data source manager to get the data source. It takes a use data source property directly, and you can pass it a function that defines how you want to render or visualize the data. As for the different TypeScript types of data sources, depending on what specific data source you're using, you'll have different functionalities and thus different types. So for example, the feature layer data source has a property called layer that you can use to get an instance of the ArcGIS Maps SDK for JavaScript layer object, where other types like the web map data source would not have that. Data views are a cool concept in Experience Builder. You can think of them similar to views in a relational database where the table is the actual data source. So they have similar interfaces as data sources, just with a few extra properties. So you'll see the power of data views when you see how builders, people who are building Experience Builder apps, use them in the Experience Builder interface. So let me show that real quick. All right, so I'm going to use the same Experience Builder that I was using before, but let's create a new experience and use this USA template. So I've got an experience that just has a single layer, the USA sample USA states layer on it. And let's go to the data tab, which is probably something that maybe we developers don't go to as much. But I can actually click the map and then click the feature layer in my map. And you can see there's a lot of, this is a pretty complex panel. There's a lot of stuff going on here. But I'm going to click the cogwheel. And that will allow me to add additional filters, sorting, or even records. So in this case, I'm going to kind of, what if we want to filter the data actually in our map? Of course, we could do that in the web map, but what if we don't want to do it in the web map? What if we want to do it only in our application? Well, you can do that right here on the data source, which is pretty cool. So in this case, let's just arbitrarily maybe say where the population is greater than, I forget, 5 million or something. Let's see if that's good. And you can kind of see a preview over here, which is nice. Let's get a good, okay. So now we're like filtering down. So I'm gonna apply these. We can see immediately that because I'm using that data source on my map, that map is immediately updated. We can also, of course, add a list widget. And this is where kind of the power of data sources, and you probably all sort of know this already, but if I use the same data source here, I can unlock the widget, reference the state name here, and so now we've got a list of that data here. Selection data source. Oh yeah. So I guess one other thing to show on that, sorry, let me go back, are those data views. So now that we've got our layer filtered, let me go back to the data source and I'm going to create a view this time. So now we've got that filtered list, and we can even, in the data view, again, it's sort of like a database view in a sense, we can create another data view that we can even further filter. So now maybe in my data view, I want to go with area is greater than, let me find just the large states with large populations, for example. Let's do, I don't know, 10,000. All right. Okay, so now I've got this data view. So now I've got the original data over on the map. And if I go into my list, right here in this dropdown are the views. So this is something I don't use a lot. I'm guessing maybe some of you haven't used a lot. But now I can actually select this data view for my list. And it's going to show that even smaller, shorter list because it's using that data view. So kind of some powerful ways to utilize your data that doesn't require you to kind of change it outside of Experience Builder. A common request when building a custom widget, and I think we got a few questions about this just today, is kind of like display the selected records in maybe a business specific way or a workflow specific way. So to do that, you'll use the selection data source. This is a data view, which I was just talking about, but this is a special data view on the main data source. And it has the same ID as the main data source's ID with a dash selection appended to it. And you can use this ID to get the selection data source and then set up listeners to show that data. So let me show you about selection data sources. Okay. So this is some code for an Experience Builder widget. It's some code that I think I have written. It's probably something that you would have written too. So it's basically using the GMU map view component. So in our settings panel, we're allowing the users to select a map. And here we're calling in our active view change handler, basically when we get an instance of that map, we check to see if we've actually have it jmv.view, and then we're using the reactive utils to say when the map view's selected feature changes, go ahead and display the currently selected state name, right? So this is like fairly standard JavaScript API code. Let's see it working. So over here, so this is that widget in action. The widget is right down here on the bottom left. If I select a state, there it says California. When I select Arizona, there it says Arizona. And it's even selecting it in this out-of-the-box list widget, which I have up here. Anybody see the problem here? I couldn't hear you, but I'm gonna assume you said data sources, because that's the section we're in, and you're right. So if I select on the list, let me select Arkansas, it selects it in the map, but in my custom widget, it still says Arizona. What? That's not right. Well, that's because we're not properly using data sources, right? We were using our widget is working directly with the map, but we're not actually using the data sources within Experience Builder, so we're not properly connected into all of the out-of-the-box widgets. So the proper way to do this is to use data sources instead of connecting directly to the map. So this is a updated version of that widget, and this is using some of the stuff that I've talked about in the slides, right? Data source component, that's what I mentioned in the slides, is a component that's provided by Experience Builder that makes it easier for us to display data source content. And the data source component is really cool because you can pass it, you're passing it, you can pass it a reference to a function. And so here I'm passing it a reference to a function called data render. And up above, I have this data render function, and it passes you the data source that you can use. So I don't have to use the data source manager to get the data source, it's giving it to me right there, which is very nice. So in my code here, I'm saying if the data source is defined and if its status is loaded, go ahead and call get selected records. And this goes back to our business use case, right? We want to get the selected items. And let's get the selected records and get the field names of state names. And then we'll just return what we want it to display. So in this case, very simple, a little div that says selected state and those selected records. So in theory, this should work a little bit better. Let me do what I was doing before, clicking California, yep, says California, Arizona says Arizona, yep. But before, when I was selecting the list, it wasn't working. So let me select Arkansas. Arkansas is on the map, and now Arkansas is down in our custom widget too. So just showing there that when we're properly using data sources, we properly integrate with the rest of Experience Builder, and your life is going to be probably easier. What if we wanted to take this example just even a little bit further, right? Maybe we want to not just display the value, but we also want people to be able to set the value in our custom widget. Just like we can set the selected value in the map by clicking a feature, we can set the selected value in the list by clicking on an item in the list. We also want to allow people to do that in our custom widget as well. Well, we can change our example just a little bit. So I'm still using the data source component. I'm still passing it the reference to the data render function. And I've just updated my data render function a little bit. This code's all exactly the same, but what we're returning, instead of just the text, I'm going to return a list, or sorry, an array of buttons, right? And so on each of these buttons, I'm saying on click, data source, I'm getting reference to the data source, and I'm calling the select record by ID, and I'm passing the ID of the data record. And so this is going to render a bunch of buttons, and I'll show it to you right here. So here it is, not super fancy because each button is just like a number, right? But you can see here that as I select these buttons, it's changing the selection data source, and the map widget as well as the list widget are updating. And I can do that in reverse as well, of course. And in fact, this is, I'm sure you're all familiar with the examples that Experience Builder provides. We have it in that repo, the Experience Builder SDK resources repo. This is one of the examples that's out there. So that is selection data sources. So for the final topic here, and how are we doing on time? Pretty good. We wanted to talk about widget communication. So specifically the idea of sharing state or events between widgets. It's a common pattern when you're getting into more advanced Experience Builder development. There are a variety of ways that you can share information and events between two widgets. One of the best ones is what I just showed in the previous section, having two widgets use a common data source. This works great for sharing selection or filtering data sources. So be sure to think about this. In many cases, using a common data source is really all you need to do instead of some of these more complex examples. There are some others like data actions, message subscribing, and Redux that you can use as a custom widget developer, and I'll talk about those over the next few slides here. The first one is data actions. This is mainly for the use case of out-of-the-box widgets that have actions menus, like the list widget and the feature table widget. For example, let's say you want to allow the user to select a feature, and then in the actions menu of the feature table, you want them to have a custom menu entry that causes something to happen in the custom widget. That's the main use case for data actions. Okay, so here is an example widget to do this. So my custom widget is up here on the top left, and then I've got a list widget here, and I've got the out-of-the-box table widget down here. And so I'm just going to select one of the states, and you can see when I select it in the list, it's selecting in the table. And right here in my actions, we can do a lot of these actions are the out-of-the-box ones: zoom to, view in table, pan to. Those all come with Experience Builder. This show IDs is the special one. So when I click that, it's actually causing something to happen in my custom widget. So that's kind of how the use case for data actions. So to do this, it's pretty simple. You tell Experience that you want to have a data action in your manifest.json file. And then you point it to a TypeScript file. In this case, we're calling it show IDs, that extends the abstract data action, and it has two functions: is supported and on execute. Is supported is just what it sounds like, right? You're going to return a true or false depending on it passes in the data sets, and you're going to say if your action is supported and it should be shown. And then when the person actually clicks the action in the menu, then on execute is going to be called. In this example, we're basically calling, the key thing is update state value of feature IDs. And then in the feature IDs, let me see, is this where I have? Yeah, so in the actual widget code, sorry to switch quickly there, but we've got feature IDs, and then in the actual widget code, you'll see I'm actually using that feature IDs. I'm calling mutable state props.feature IDs, and I can actually use it, and that's where we were showing it in our actual widget up here. So that's kind of how those work, data actions. Now, message subscribing, that's kind of the next option. Message subscribing allows you to create an entry in the message actions configuration panel for other widgets and allow Experience Builder configuration people to connect their widgets to your widget. So that when certain actions happen in those widgets, you can respond with your widget. So note that this is different than the data actions that I was just showing. Here we're referring to the message actions panel that is in the builder interface of Experience Builder. So, and you can see a screenshot of what I'm talking about here, this actions panel here. So let's look at an example for these. So for here, I've got my custom widget down here at the bottom left, and I've set up a data action with this widget, so that when this widget changes, it'll update in my widget. So this is kind of to show that it's different than data sources. Like when I select it on the map, the data source is changing, but I'm not actually getting an update here in my custom widget. But because I've connected via the message subscriber only on this widget, when I change it here, you'll see here that I'm getting Virginia and I'm getting an object ID. So that's the kind of message action that I've connected directly between my custom widget and this out-of-the-box widget. All right. So for the last one, this is the last one. The party's almost there. We're getting close. The Redux store method is best for cases where you want to communicate between two custom widgets and you kind of control both of those. Or that's how we use them in our projects most often. It follows like standard Redux patterns, and so you can kind of refer to the Redux documentation, or you're probably familiar with Redux if you've used if you're familiar with React development. And there's a really good Redux sample. I don't have an active sample here, but this is basically kind of how it works. We have a really good Redux sample on the documentation. So if you're needing this example, go here and use it. It's got the reducer, it's got the actions. This is all stuff that if you're familiar with Redux, you should be familiar with. And then the key thing is adding it to the manifest.json. You tell Experience that you have extensions and you list your Redux store there. So that's kind of how to communicate between kind of two custom widgets. All right. And just like that, that's pretty much all we had. We wanted to leave you with a few session resources. So we've got the links to the slides that Paige and I are showing and some of the code that's listed at the top. Of course, the Experience Builder developer documentation is a really, really good resource. That's at developers.arcgis.com. It's got guides, it's got tutorials, it's got samples, anything you need, the API documentation, anything you need to get going with custom widget development. And then the Esri community is really good. All of you are out there actively sharing widgets, sharing concepts, discussing things. So please go to the Esri community, find custom widgets. Reminder to share your feedback in the app. And I think we might have some time for questions. Do you want to take a few?
Yeah.
All right, we'll take a few questions. So thank you very much.
I have three questions. First is in first demo, you use data sources. You registered with the setting of the custom widget, but you haven't registered with the framework of the Experience Builder with this use data source. And is it something what is necessary or okay? Because then it is not visible in the data sources panel in Experience Builder.
The question is around data sources, and it was, I think, your example of like how you register it in the settings panel.
But I didn't register it in such a way that it would be able to communicate either with the framework or with other widgets. Is that, are we correctly restating the question? So in my case, it was not the intention for my widget to communicate with the framework or other widgets, so that's why I didn't do anything like that.
Could you differentiate also like between use data source type, which is in the setting, and the main data source type, which is in the widget side, because it's two types, different properties, but they are connected together. I'm just confused with this concept.
The question's around like the difference between use data sources, which is like saved when you're saving in the settings, and the actual data source, which is what you can get a reference to in the widget. I believe, Paige, you can. I believe the use data source is more about how it's saved within the config.json and through the settings, and then you need to use that. You need to. It's almost like a string that you pass to the data source component to get a reference to the actual data source. Is that fairly correct?
Correct, yeah.
Okay. We'll go with another person because there's more questions, other people with questions.
If you build a custom widget and you put it onto Enterprise, you only have some teams be able to pull it from that custom into like Experience Builder.
The question is, if I create a custom widget and I put it in ArcGIS Enterprise, can I only allow certain users to use it? I'm actually not sure on that. Do you think?
I would say you could accomplish that through sharing.
Yeah, through sharing
So once
the
you've
item.
added your widget as an item in Portal, you could then modify it either by creating groups where all group members have access and share it that way.
Yeah, I think that should work. Yeah. Are there any good questions online, Wei, or?
Yes, I received so many questions online. I can't even read them all.
Maybe
so,
we'll do one from online and one in the room, and then we'll be done.
Okay, let's see. I see some question about the hosting manifest file to the web server. They said, is it required, like using the URL required host to a web server and access via URL, or can it be a local fast file path?
Yeah. So I think it needs to be the full URL to the widget. So that's oftentimes, like I was saying, people will host them on the same as your ArcGIS Enterprise or somewhere else, but generally it's the full URL. Yeah, that's a good question. And then do we have one more from the room?
So in terms of custom theme deployment, right, the only way that I currently know how to deploy a custom theme is to deploy the whole experience as a whole, only use all that experience. Is there any way to maybe transfer the custom theme to your other experience builders or live in that environment?
Questions around custom themes and using them in multiple experiences. I believe if you're using Developer Edition, there is an idea of actually creating a theme, and you can use that across multiple experiences. Are you referring to more like if you make you tweak some colors in one experience, and I want to move those same tweaks to another experience? Oh, okay. I think in that case, Paige, I don't know if you have ideas. I would probably create a template, which you saw that I was doing in I had some templates and I created an experience from that. So you can create a template and create multiple experiences from that same template. The downside there is that if you make changes later, you'd have to make those same changes across the experiences, but that at least gets you a start. Any other ideas? Okay. I think since it sounds like people want to get to the party, we'll leave it there. Paige and I will hang out. Paige and Wei and I will hang out for a few more minutes. If you have any questions, you can come up. But thank you so much, and we'll see you guys at the party in a few minutes.
Thank you.